It's been just over 4 years since Cyberpunk's catastrophic launch, and depending on who you ask, catastrophic may not be a strong enough descriptor. The launch version of this game was so bad that Sony, a company who has a notoriously scummy refund policy, offered refunds without question. By the way, their refund policy is that if you even start the download on a game, you forfeit the right to a refund. It's very scummy, but that's a whole other topic. Sony also removed the game from the PlayStation Store, and then it took almost 7 months for Sony to allow it back on their platforms. Which is really funny when you consider that up until recently, Sony was allowing AI-generated slop on their platform completely unfiltered. Xbox and Steam also offered refunds, but neither removed the game from their store. I feel like I lucked out greatly. My very first playthrough was pretty much bug-free. The worst I had was a gig auto-failing when entering the appropriate building, and another was driving over the bridge to Japantown and a small section of the road didn't load in properly. If I had other bugs or issues happen to me, I've completely forgotten them. But, despite the state of the launch, I remember ending my original playthrough being quite fond of the game. Throughout all of the problems, there was a decent amount of fun to be had, and deep down in the pits of the game, I could absolutely see some really strong foundations. Before I start talking about my experience with this second playthrough, I just want to say that me having a good, bug-free experience back at launch is not me downplaying how bad the launch was. Firstly, I want to briefly talk about my expectations and how I categorize RPGs. I split these types of games into 2 categories: gameplay RPG and story/narrative RPG. Some games really focus on one aspect, others both. Every game is different and every subgenre of RPG is different. I'm not going to expect a JRPG to allow me to have dialogue choices that can drastically change outcomes like in a Western RPG, for example. The gameplay and RPG systems are usually front and center. I think a really good example of this is Baldur's Gate 3, specifically Astarion's questline and the choice you make at the end. You have 2 choices here. Let Astarion ascend and take over the role of Vampire Lord, which puts him on the path of evil, innocents die, and all the vampire spawn prisoners are killed. The other choice is letting Astarion kill Cazador and refusing the ascension. This gives you the choice on what to do with the prisoners. The choices are killing them, setting them free, or handing them over to the vampire hunters. From a narrative perspective, this is a really hard choice, especially if you went through Astarion's personal quest and understanding his story. I remember spending roughly 2 days away from the game, conversing with others and just talking to them about the choices before I returned and carried on. From a gameplay standpoint, this is one of the easiest choices in the known universe. That's because if you make Astarion into a vampire lord, he gains 1d10 necrotic damage to all of his weapon and unarmed attacks. It's a no-brainer. Whilst typing this up, I've realised that this probably isn't the best example, but I still hope this gives a decent enough idea of what I mean and my expectations from different types of RPGs.
You pussy! Got you now!
Most of your time with Cyberpunk will be spent in combat scenarios. This is fine if combat varies and changes throughout a playthrough. That just doesn't happen in Cyberpunk. The combat loop is as follows. You enter an area, kill 8 to 10 enemies, pick up what you need, leave. That's it. That's the entire combat loop, start to finish. And yeah, you can get small variations in enemies like netrunners, melee, or ranged, but that's it. The problem is that none of these enemies ever really do anything interesting. They exist to be target dummies. This is made worse when coupled with the skill tree and builds available to you. My intention for this playthrough was to be close range, bladed melee, and a shotgun for secondary. I felt like no matter what I done or how I played each combat encounter, my damage output was just way too high. Enemies just couldn't fight back at all. For the first half of the game, I focused on the reflex attribute tree. So stamina/dashing and blade branches. Even while focusing blades, I could pull out my shotgun and if not one shot, 2 shot most enemies. That's without any gun-specific cyberware or any shotgun skill points. I genuinely have no idea why the game is this easy. This playthrough was done on hard. I didn't pick very hard because, second hardest should be a decent challenge, and hardest should be something where it requires the player to be quite knowledgeable on the game and its mechanics. In the background, I'm playing footage of me just fighting NCPD for 27 minutes. At no point during this was I ever at threat of dying. I have so many tools at my disposal keeping me alive, and frankly overpowered skills from the skill tree. And this is just in a clip where I'm being bombarded by constant hordes of enemies and damage. There are times during this where I would stand in the middle of the road reloading my shotgun, letting myself get shot, and I'm still not in any sort of danger. So you can imagine what the rest of the game is like with significantly less enemies and less damage being thrown my way. With the 2.0 update, CDPR overhauled a lot of the game's systems, namely cyberware and the skill tree. Let me start with cyberware. I don't think this actually changed all too much between 1.0 and 2.0, but things did change. The biggest changes now is that cyberware has a capacity limit, which is increased by leveling up or by progressing the engineer's skill tree. This is also where you get your armor from, so no longer do you just equip the ugliest pieces of clothing you own and slap on armadillo mods into every slot to become unkillable. The problem is, even with all these changes and improvements, the fundamentals stayed the same. In my experience, I barely paid attention to what a cyberware done. Early game, I equipped melee-centric stuff and just stacked armor. By the time I switched to mainly shotgun, I just stopped paying attention and equipped whatever gave me the most armor. Each piece of cyberware also comes with 2 modifiers, 3 if you take a specific perk from the technical ability tree. As far as I can tell, at the baseline, these never change. It doesn't matter which Ripper dock you go to, where you get the cyberware from, the 2 mods it spawns with will always be the same. And then the only control you have in changing these mods is by taking a specific perk on the technical ability tree that allows you to randomize the 3 mods upon upgrading the rarity of that cyberware. You have no real input over which mods you choose from other than the 3 you have already and the multiple choice of random mods. It feels like a really shallow attempt at getting the player to choose stats for theory crafting a build. In 1.0, back when gear was clothing, they had mod slots, and as you progress the game, you would find recipes to craft mods or just find mods themselves. Was this a perfect system? No, but it's kind of strange to me that CDPR seemed to believe this system was either bad or just not good enough to build upon. And it's even stranger that with the 2.0 update, CDPR seemingly removed mod slots from a bunch of weapons. You can go back and watch a bunch of footage from around launch and see that weapons, especially iconic guns, have 5 or even 6 mod slots. Jump forward to now and they just don't. A small handful of iconics have 1 or maybe in rare cases 2 mod slots, but the problem is that iconics are almost always better than a regular non-iconic. It's really baffling to me as to why CDPR would gut customization like this. Allowing players to pick and choose stats and craft their own build is one of the core pillars of RPGs. Which brings me to the skill tree, and boy is this a boring skill tree. It's significantly better than the 1.0 skill tree, but it's still underwhelming. There isn't much synergy going around here. For weapons, you just get every perk in that branch, and then they have very little relevance to other weapon types. For example, in the blade tree there's a perk called Flash of Steel, and the effect is plus 25% movement speed and attack speed for 6 seconds after performing a finisher. This only affects the blade weapon type. This quite literally becomes useless if you use anything other than a bladed weapon. Imagine if this had a bit more of a sweeping use. Perform a finisher and get fire rate or reload speed added as a general buff. There's just a lot of waste taking certain points. There's also things that just feel required, like the cyberware stuff in the technical ability tree. License to Chrome level 2 gives you plus 40 flat armor, and level 3 of that perk allows you to equip a 3rd skeleton cyberware, which is a massive buff to your armor. And then of course the Edge Runner perk. You will be severely lacking in cyberware capacity without taking this, and it's extremely easy to fill up the surplus capacity you gain. It really does feel like CDP are intended for you to take the Edge Runner branch, and it's such a strange way to design an RPG. You also kind of snowball into power pretty quickly, because the game just throws XP, attribute points, and perk points at you. Seriously, I could be halfway through a level, go and do one single story mission, and get so much XP that I'm back to halfway to leveling again. If you end up doing side quests, gigs, NCPD scans, etc., it's going to be even faster. Throughout the game, you get access to 81 total attribute points. This is enough to max out 4 of the 5 attributes on offer. Giving me access to so much of the perk trees cheapens the experience of theory crafting a build. I would take far less attribute points to have each attribute give more, so you can still feel the impact of increasing an attribute. I know I've been quite harsh on the gameplay, but overall I think the game is fun to play, just in a mindless sense. I think the foundation is great, the execution is not. I would probably say that a lot of it is down to how the game was developed. Yeah, a lot changed in the 2.0 patch, but for any major system to change in any significant way, they probably would have needed to remake the entire game, and that's just not feasible. I just hope that they take these gameplay foundations and build upon them for Project Orion.
Who you work for, start talking.
Fuck.
Fuck.
Fucking Chip.
Rip the thing out myself.
No, wait!
Next up is the story and the quests you'll do throughout the game. Overall, I enjoyed the story this game tells, but it feels disconnected from the rest of the game. I'm going to try my hardest to explain what I mean here. To me, it feels like the game has 2 world states, quest and free roam. The events of the main story quests don't ever really get reflected onto the world. The choices you make are often vapid and usually end up being yes or no in different tones. For example, when you go to Maelstrom to buy the robot with Jackie, on your way out you can find Brick locked up in a room. You can kill him, free him, or leave him there. Depending on what you do and what you decide to do with Royce during the boss fight, it determines who leads the Maelstrom. Sounds good, right? The thing is, you literally will not know who leads them until you do the Kerry quest chain, which by the way is an optional quest line, and go to find Nancy at the Maelstrom Club. And once you leave, it's never brought up again. In a gameplay sense, Maelstrom are still enemies. And I'm not saying that Maelstrom had to become allies after that, but maybe some Maelstrom related side quests or gigs could slightly change, depending on who ends up leading them. Another choice you can make is whether or not you save Takamura after Arasaka attacks the apartment building. In my first playthrough, I didn't even know you could save him, so this time I decided to save him. The funny thing is, regardless if you save him or not, it's like he becomes a non-existent character. You let him die, well, obviously he won't be around. But if you save him, you get a text from him telling you he's safe, and well, then he just disappears. He has no personal quest or presence in the rest of the game. The next time you see him is if you specifically pick the Arasaka ending, or if you don't, the phone calls you get during the credits. This also extends to pretty much every character and quest. Everything happens in a vacuum. The world doesn't really seem to react to the game's general goings on. You get the occasional news broadcast, but that's about it. For me personally, that's not enough. When all the main characters in your story don't interact or know each other, it leads to this disconnect where all of your actions and choices throughout the story have no real impact. And speaking of characters, the individual stories you interact with during the main story are great. Panam and Judy, less so Takamura, all have interesting and compelling stories. But again, these stories never overlap and just exist in their own bubble. Panam is a great example of this. The first time you see her is at the Afterlife, and she's arguing with Rogue about a gig she messed up. This is the driving force of her entire questline, proving her worth to the people around her. As you progress her quest, she opens up about her failed gig and relationship with Rogue, and you can have this conversation with her about what she should do. The next time this is brought up though, she kind of just tells you it's been resolved off screen, and I get it. It wouldn't make much sense for V to be there for that. However, I am not V, and as a player, I wanted to be there to see that. The story does this quite a lot, where things will happen narratively, and it makes you wonder what the outcome will be or what the solution will be. But then the game just does it for you. The story never really has much downtime. You'll finish a quest after some big events go down, then like 5 minutes after you will get a phone call being like, hey man, I know shit just went down, but I've got the perfect solution. And I'm just sitting there like, sure, I guess. Which is a great segue into the general pacing of this game. In my opinion, it is really bad. The story has 3 acts, standard stuff for a story. That is until you realise that Act 3 is just the final quest, the point of no return. Everything else in Act 3 is completely optional. So the pacing is as follows. Act 1 is setting up and pulling off the heist with Jackie. Act 2 is where you do the 3 adjacent quest lines. And Act 3 is the final quest. It really feels like CDPR attempted to do what Larian eventually done with Baldur's Gate 3 in giving the player a basic main objective and letting the player explore the world to see what happens. I think a good example of this is all the romances and side story in Act 3, specifically Johnny's quest. The oil field scene is, without a doubt, the best scene in the entire game. It's when Johnny and V put their differences aside and in a way become friends, provided you pick the correct dialogue. You spend all these hours bickering and being assholes to one another, and when this scene comes, it's pretty cathartic. It's just a shame that this is completely missable. We can debate endlessly which questline should or shouldn't be part of the main quest, but the Johnny stuff in Act 3 absolutely should have been. Attempting to reconnect with Rogue, finding all the old band members and getting them back for one final gig are moments the game's main story lacks. As I said, there's little downtime, and I get it. There's supposed to be a sense of urgency, with the relic giving V a slow and painful death, but Johnny's quest is progressed by the transitions to each act, so it's really weird that they just didn't finish it in a main quest setting too. Act 3 is where the romance options start popping up, and you can start deciding on who you want to pick. I'm just going to rip the band-aid off. I don't really like any of these romance options. Panam is who I romanced in both of my playthroughs, and something I noticed specifically in this second playthrough was how unnatural Rivers and Kerry's romance felt. Rivers' romance is really weird. His entire quest line is about finding a kidnapper who took his nephew and other kids, and it's a really tragic and disturbing story. Throughout the whole quest, River and V's chemistry comes across as entirely transactional. You're both doing this to catch a criminal. There's no romantic chemistry at all during this quest. Then, when you do the epilogue of the quest line, you go up to the water tower and you get the option to kiss him. I wouldn't say that this is bad, it's just very weird, and Kerry's romance has the same feeling almost too. Kerry kind of just drags you along this warpath against the Uscracks, and you just have to sit back and watch. Then towards the end, you just get the option to kiss him. Once again, little to no romantic chemistry throughout his questline, outside of the fact that Johnny tells you Kerry tried to have sex with him on multiple occasions, and I guess that transfers to me. I don't know. I don't think either of these romances are that great. Panam is the only one who really feels natural. Over the course of her questline, she goes from not really trusting you and treating you more like a business partner to opening up to V about her relationship with Night City and the El Ducados. From start to finish, her questline has V and Panam forming a bond and spending a lot of time together. The others just aren't really like this. I don't know if this is a troubled development thing or if CDPR just didn't really know what to do with romances, but they're not great. Also, I kinda lied very slightly. The side quests in Act 3 do serve a purpose, and that's getting to choose what ending you get. The more side quests you complete, the more options you get. Which brings me to the final point of the story segment, and that's how the game ends.
Kinda tough deciding which of your friends get to die, isn't it? Good news is you got this one chum who's already dead. And he'd be honored to join you on a wild suicide run.
For the most part, the endings are pretty much just reskins of another. There's some outliers here for sure, but most endings are just assaulting Arasaka Tower. You can choose to do it solo through a secret ending, or you can choose to bring along a person or group you finished a questline for. The problem is that if you choose to assault Arasaka Tower, the contents doesn't really change. No matter who you bring, someone will die to Adam Smasher just before his boss fight. And all of these endings still lead to Mikoshi, where you choose to get rid of Johnny or let Johnny take over, which once again, just like the rest of the game, very little impactful choices. I get that the endings are supposed to be bleak and somewhat tragic, but I don't think it's too far-fetched for an ending where we just succumb to Johnny's desires and nuke Arasaka Tower again. It would have been great, and I think it would be in line with the bleak ending themes. Also, I don't really like Adam Smasher as an antagonist. The game's narrative doesn't really give you a reason to hate him or want to fight him. He also just doesn't have any real presence in the story, which makes it so much worse. He appears during the heist twice, he has 2 lines of dialogue during the parade, he gets mentioned during the Chipping In quest when you go to the Ebunike, then finally at Arasaka Tower during the ending. I guess the intention is that as you bond with Johnny over the course of the game, you're supposed to share a hatred for Smasher, but in my opinion this just doesn't work. And that's because Smasher never gives V a reason to hate him or want to fight him, like Johnny does, and what Smasher done to Johnny in the past. In my personal opinion, something simple CDPR could have done to really spark the flame of hate for Smasher is to have him be the reason why the drone sees V and Jackie on the roof of the Konpeki Plaza. This would indirectly lead to Jackie's death, which should hopefully cause players to want to get revenge and have a grudge against Smasher. Overall, it's the little moments contained within this game that makes the story worth going through the negatives. I really like the story this game tries to tell. I just wish the presentation and pacing was better.
Now or never! Send it to the scrapyard! Give it a taste!
Rust and piss, shitbot!
Finally, I'm going to talk about Phantom Liberty, the only expansion Cyberpunk received that released alongside the 2.0 update. I had pretty high expectations going into this. Since release, all that I have seen is pretty heavy praise. And while I was going through base game, I was talking to others, and as I was mentioning my grievances with the base game, they would reassure me that the DLC addresses it. And, for the most part, it did. One of the things I didn't like about the base game is just how little agency you have with story and choices. The DLC directly addresses this with the choices presented to me. The very first side quest that appears to you is called Balls to the Wall. You meet a bar guest recruit that's gotten himself into a bit of a bad situation. The short end of it is that he was stealing from Kurt Hansen, and after showing me what happened through the use of drugs, he's now asked me for help. You get 3 options here. Tell him to leave Dogtown, where you help him get past the border. You can call up a favour from one of the side job quest lines during Act 3, but because I hadn't done any of that yet on my save file at the time, I never got this option. These 2 options lead to the same outcome pretty much, where he gets out of this unscathed. The third option is to frame one of Kurt's lieutenants, Yuri, who you see during the drug-induced visions. This is the option I picked. This leads to a mini-boss with Yuri, where after defeating him, you find a note on his body that details a conversation between him and Kurt, ordering him to kill Paco, the recruit we are helping. After reading this note, you get a new objective to go find Paco's body, which has been beheaded and hanging in another part of Dogtown. When I first fought Yuri, I had accidentally killed him, so I reloaded my save and kept him alive instead, on the off chance that there was a conversation or later on in the story he might pop up again and remember our encounter. But there was nothing. The wiki does say that Yuri appears during the Firestarter quest, but I don't remember seeing him anywhere. The side jobs and gigs are a lot better than the base game. There is a decent amount more choice here, but it still comes down to all feeling like it exists in a vacuum. Nothing you do here actually affects Dogtown as a whole, and I can't think of a more perfect example than the quest Run This Town. This quest is given to you by Mr. Hands, and he tells you that there are 2 candidates to taking over Dogtown after Kurt Hansen dies. Mr. Hands tells you that he has a specific preference as to who wins this succession. As far as I can tell, you have full control over which candidate becomes the new leader. But when this is all said and done, nothing changes within Dogtown. And don't get it twisted, I'm not asking for Dogtown to become completely different, but simple changes can go a long way. Have the Barghest patrols take new routes, reduce or increase the amount of people in those patrols. The thing that annoys me the most with this quest specifically is how the pre-recorded message that you often hear throughout Dogtown from Kurt doesn't change at all. No matter who you choose to run Dogtown, it stays as the Kurt one, which again, small changes can go a long way. Gameplay wise, not much new here. 10 extra levels, some new guns, new cyberware. The main attraction here though is the relic tree, which I'm quite disappointed by, but based on the base game tree, I'm not really surprised. The relic tree has 3 starting points: vulnerability analytics, emergency cloaking, and jailbreak. 2 of these affect and buff your cyberware. Emergency cloaking is obviously optic camo, and jailbreak buffs arm cyberware like mantis blades or gorilla arms. I don't really find these that interesting. They're a bit too specific. For example, taking jailbreak allows you to leap attack with mantis blades. But here's the problem. Mantis blades do less damage than most katanas. Okay, so I take this for the utility of the leap, right? Well, my leg implants allow me to double jump, and I've taken a perk on the skill tree to allow me to air dash, which I can make free stamina wise with the capstone. The only remotely useful relic tree perk is the vulnerability one, which as you fight, these diamonds spawn on enemies. Hitting them gives you buffs, like crit chance, armor penetration, and weak spot damage bonuses. This was probably the most disappointing aspect of the DLC, but not unexpected, especially with how the skill tree is in the base game. Finally is the story of Phantom Liberty, and I've got a lot to say. Phantom Liberty is very separated from the base game. It's very much its own thing, essentially a side quest chain. It can lead to some new endings for the game as a whole, but for the most part this DLC has no bearing on the base game story. The premise of the DLC is, what if James Bond existed in Night City? To me, that's a very interesting concept of spies and government foul play in a setting that is staunchly anti-corporation and government. The story starts with a phone call telling you to go to the Dogtown entrance, which is where you meet So-Mi for the first time. You have one of your relic episodes and she stops it and tells us that she has access to the relic in some capacity. This is one of the most interesting and frustrating scenes in the whole DLC. So-Mi and Johnny interact before she cuts him off so that the episode doesn't kill me. This is a really cool scene because the relic inside V's head is a prototype from over 50 years prior, and this 31-year-old has the tech and net running know-how to interact with it. Here's the frustrating part, it's never really brought up again, and worst of all, Johnny doesn't really talk about it. In the base game, I can't remember exactly when, Johnny talks about what it's like being inside Mikoshi for over 50 years and how his consciousness was in suspension all alone. It's frustrating because I would have liked a scene where Johnny talks about the experience, how he feels about the possibilities of this relic technology in the future, positive or negative. Progressing through the main story, you meet the 3 main characters that are central to this story. Solomon Reed, a government sleeper agent that's been waiting years for a mission. Alex Xenakis, an undercover agent who used to work with Reed in the same squad. And Song So-Mi, an FIA agent who also used to work with Reed. There are other characters present obviously, but none of them have the presence or relevancy that these 3 have. Let's take Kurt Hansen for example. From the get-go, he is positioned as the primary antagonist. However, you only meet him twice during your time in Dogtown, and the second time, he dies. And depending on the choice you make during that second encounter, you might not even be the one to actually kill him. I think Phantom Liberty's story has the opposite problem of what I mentioned of the base game. The three main characters we interact with have an overlapping story and there's actual cohesion there. But once again, it kind of falls apart when in free roam. The DLC still has the two world state problem of the base game. As you push through the main quest, a rift opens up between So, Me and Reed, leading to an eventual choice of who you want to betray. I like this a lot. This is something the base game needed more of. However, I think the build up to this choice could have been presented a bit better. And that's because Songbird has no real presence for a majority of the main quest. And for Reed, everyone you talk to about him is like, yeah, Reed's a pathetic government rat through and through. He will use you and betray you. Just before the choice actually happens, there's two scenes that take place. One with Reed and one with Songbird. This is where each character, I guess, subconsciously makes their plea to side with them. For me, this was a little jarring because it's very obvious that the developers essentially look directly at the camera and go, this is where you need to listen to make a choice. It just isn't subtle. I chose to betray Reed because, you know, the game all about hating corporations and higher powers doesn't really make it convincing to side with the government rat. And once again, I wish there were more ramifications for this. I betrayed the government. I am a traitor. I committed treason. But it never once feels like that. I'm just roaming free with no consequences. Betraying Reed leads to the Killing Moon quest, and in my opinion, this is the best quest in the entire game. This quest is a look at what the rest of the game could have or should have been. The start of this quest is trying to sneak into a specific terminal, and when you have your scan done by security, this is where you can sort of deviate. I, like a fool, decided to threaten security, which got me knocked out and detained. However, I still got inside where I needed to be. It was a completely viable option. The other way is to do the scan like a normal person, and then find something in the airport to help you sneak through. I don't know if this was a response to the criticism of base game being light on choices, but I love this, and I hope that CDPR are going into Orion with this game design mindset. After sneaking around to a certain point, you help Songbird get in, and the mission kind of just becomes the same regardless of how you get to this point. After killing upwards of 200 police officers, which is a straight up terrorism by the way, probably worse in some capacity than Johnny nuking Arasaka. How we walked out of that airport scot-free is beyond me. You get some downtime while riding on the train with Songbird. This is where she tells you that the cure you've been working so hard to get for the both of you will only create one dosage. I think this is CDPR's attempt at maintaining the no happy endings in Night City motto. But I don't think this really works, because everything you learn about Songbird points to her being a victim that you as V can relate to. She's doing all this to escape this life, a life she never really asked for. On your way to taking Songbird to the spaceship to send her off, Reed walks out and tells you to put her down. He gives you an option to give her up or he will kill you and take her by force, which is where you draw your weapon and kill him. I'm going to be honest, I have zero remorse in killing Reed. My problem with these two pathways is that the game is all about the corruption of corporations and governments that oppress. And the two options are someone who was abused by the system or an unapologetic government rat. It's made worse by Johnny and how he talks about these two characters. From the get-go, he does not like or trust Reed, and that never really changes as you progress the story. With Songbird, Johnny only really says positive things about her, and when you're watching the spaceship fly off, Johnny essentially just goes, "You made the right choice, she's a good kid." It kind of feels like Johnny is conditioning the player to think a certain way about each of these characters, and it kind of has a weird feeling once it's all over. Maybe it's because the story is somewhat shorter and CDPR couldn't really fit these characters' entire arcs into the main quest. I just think it could have all been paced and presented a bit better. I know I've been quite harsh on the game, but I promise it's from a place of love. The Witcher 3 is one of my all-time favourites. It's a game that will always be a part of me. It's what made me fall in love with CDPR as developers. So to see CDPR's next game after The Witcher 3 sort of downgrade the systems and writing style in comparison to The Witcher 3, it's a little bit sad. I still love Cyberpunk 2077. It still has a lot of that CDPR charm found in their previous games. I also know the game had a bit of a troubled development, which probably didn't help. If CDPR go into Orion with a fresh mindset and applying feedback and criticism, I think Orion could be an amazing follow-up to 2077.